Hello, I'm Miles Corson from Ernst & Young, and welcome to the EY Better Finance podcast, a series that explores the changing dynamics of the business world and what it means to the finance leaders of today and tomorrow. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman of Ogilvy UK. Rory has dedicated over 3 decades to pioneering marketing strategies that harness psychological insights to create impactful campaigns. His extensive work in behavioural economics has changed conventional wisdom, particularly surrounding the prevalence of behavioural biases in business. Rory is also the author of the acclaimed book Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense, where he explores why abandoning logic and rationality is the best way to solve problems. Additionally, he is the founder of Nudgestock, the world's largest festival celebrating behavioural science and creativity, which brings together thought leaders to share insights on influencing behaviour positively. So with that, Rory, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and a wonderful opportunity to mildly abuse the finance community as well, I have to admit.
Well, yeah. I appreciate that because, again, this is a finance-focused podcast.
I know.
Finance and marketing are not necessarily
not the best of bedfellows necessarily.
Exactly. No. I was going to use that term precisely. So, the reason we connected, I'm a big fan and have read a lot of your work, both the articles and the book Alchemy, which I think is fantastic and would highly recommend. But recently, I've seen some quotes that you've given about finance and about some of the challenges that finance creates for businesses. And you talk in one quote about finance. People don't care about making money. And you also talk about this issue that there's sort of a cost-based race to the bottom rather than opportunity-driven race to the top. So perhaps you could start off by sharing some perspectives.
I probably wouldn't say they don't care about making money, but they care more about the certainty of the process than the opportunity.
Yep.
And I don't entirely blame them for that because in many ways that's what they're incentivized to do. But it does come with risks, undoubtedly, which is one of which, and I'm slightly channeling Roger L. Martin here, is an impossible standard of proof. And you can apply this not only to finance, but to the Treasury, I would argue, in government, in terms of demanding absolute certainty and predictability of any course of action before any money can be released. When, of course, we don't actually have that level of certainty about the future because by definition, we'll be operating in a different context. And there's actually a danger to that, by the way, which is, as I always say, all big data comes from the same place, the past. And there's a huge danger that you can end up over-optimizing on the past. And effectively, there's a very interesting analogy here, which I have to mention because it's kind of mandatory if I appear on a podcast. But when scientists studied bees, it was discovered, first of all, that they had this magnificent thing called the waggle dance, where they could actually communicate to the other bees, tell them where there was a reliable source of nectar and pollen. Yeah. And the other bees would obediently go off, follow their instructions and set off in the desired direction, maximizing the efficiency of collection. Fairly simple, what you might call double entry bookkeeping. Energy expended has to be less than energy collected. But then, much to their bemusement, scientists discovered that a certain percentage of bees, typically roughly 20%, seemed to ignore the waggle dance. And this baffled them because bees have been around for 20 million years, not coincidentally as long as there have been flowering plants. And it seemed odd that for 20 million years, nature would tolerate this level of inefficiency. And then they looked at it as a complex system over time, and they realized if you don't allow for the scout bees, the explorer bees, to go off at random, you become over-optimized on what you already know. You become incapable of growth, incapable of good luck or good fortune, and incapable of adaptation to changing circumstances. Yep. So you become very, very rigidly focused on a short-term model of efficiency. And if you think about it, of course, the financial standards you'd apply to the obedient bees are fairly straightforward.
Yep.
Okay. The financial standards you'd have to apply to the scout bees are closer to those you should probably apply to marketing or innovation or R&D, which is that a large part of what is done probably appears to be wasted, but that's actually a feature, not a bug. But that one time in 10, one time in 20, one time in 50, one of these bee journeys will uncover something spectacular. Now, by the way, it's absolutely vital that when these scout bees discover something new, they share it with the obedient bees.
Yep. They need to do the
And actually, it's very interesting because this pattern recurs. It seems to be fundamentally a natural law. In algorithm design, it's called the explore-exploit trade-off. In animal foraging, it's the whole question of the trade-off between exploiting what you already know and exploring what you don't, okay?
Yep.
And it also, there's a wonderful academic at King's College London who argues that this is why humans are neurodiverse. That in any group of humans, it pays to have certain people who think about things differently because there's a fundamental reward not to all having the same model of the world.
Yeah.
And why I think this is important, I can see, one interesting thing, by the way, is we call it a trade-off, but actually it isn't. It's actually a benign circle, which is the exploitation funds exploration, and exploration continually refines exploitation. Yeah. So it's really a Mobius strip. It's not two sides of the same coin. But because of our Western mindset, we tend to see, we find it much more difficult, I think, than people in the East to understand the unity of opposites, that two apparently contradictory behaviors might be contributing to a third thing that's better than either of them. But I think it's very important because in terms of the standard of proof, if you're very comfortable perhaps with measuring the exploit part of the hive.
Yep.
In other words, the maths are very easy. No journey appears to be wasteful, wonderfully measurable, easy to quantify. Now, when someone sets off on a new journey, the level of proof simply won't be that good. Okay, this is a probabilistic decision, not a deterministic decision. Yeah. And you have to look at it from a statistical standpoint. What's the potential upside? What's the risk? What are the balance of probabilities here? And the way I always describe this is that, funnily enough, when you're trying to do anything significantly new, there will never be sufficient evidence from the past to justify it. I know you're a consumer goods guy. There was zero evidence anywhere in the world that people would pay £600 for a vacuum cleaner. Okay. Yep. Literally zero. But anything involving psychology, for example, or behavior, what you don't know is often a lot more important than what you do. And therefore, anecdotal information, I'm trying to kind of rehabilitate the use of the word anecdotal as a term of approval, because interesting information often emerges first in anecdotal form, so no evidential value. Yeah. And therefore, your correct mode is investigation, exploration, and experimentation. There was an awful lot of big data in 1912 to tell the captain of the Titanic that icebergs were very rarely sighted that far south in April. Yeah. Okay. But the single data point, iceberg dead ahead, okay, kind of countermands everything else you thought you knew about icebergs. Okay. Yeah. And so this question of at what stage we should be, if you demand complete certainty, as with COVID, the only possible public advice we can give in behavior is based on things we know for certain. That's actually bad advice. Now, again, this is the question with finance, which is you can demand such a level of certainty that it becomes impossible to do anything different, because the only things you can do with complete certainty are things you've done before. And even then, okay, actually, it's worth noting that someone once said, doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. Yeah. It's actually the definition of complexity. Yeah. Because in a complex system, you can indeed do things repeatedly and they fail 5 times and then they don't because the context changed.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. So a few things. I love the analogies. The first one with the bees with the waggle dance and this idea of the Mobius strip, right? And the ecosystem.
They're complementary activities.
Needing to be in balance, right? You can't, if everyone did the same thing, you would not create the breakthrough identity. So it kind of triggers a question for me.
In fact, the reason is that the hives which didn't have scout bees got optimized on a local maximum and ended up starving to death. Yeah. That's why all bees tolerate this level of
you have to have the innovation but it sort of raises the question to me in the context of AI. How do you think about it? Because by definition, AI kind of builds on known information and creates new interpretations.
Although in ways
where's the breakthrough? Where does the breakthrough come from?
Well, the interesting question which does fascinate me is that there will be an unintended creative dividend from AI, which is entirely down to psychological factors. Which is, if you went to someone who is a very experienced marketer or very good inventor or someone, and you said, why do you think this will work? And they went, trust me, I think it'll work. Based on everything I know, my instincts tell me this will work. This would be considered in business completely unacceptable as a basis on which to make a decision. But strangely, when we replace that person with a black box computerized process, we're all going to pay attention. Now, that's a bit odd, isn't it? We're completely unwilling to take human recommendation without demanding proof of their working out and, fully rigorous kind of, logical, reverse engineered kind of post-rationalizations of how they got there. That because, you can't just take something on trust. Weirdly, and I don't ask me why, when the output is from a black box that's effectively using silicon rather than carbon, we think it's okay. No, don't ask me why that is. Well, it's probably something to do with blame avoidance, which is that in other words, the computer says no, the computer told me to do it, that we feel if we're following the instructions of some model, it's not that it's necessarily a good recommendation, but we are confident that we can't be blamed for it, which worries me a bit.
Yeah, I think I've seen some data that also goes the other way, that the expectations that we have in terms of proving out computer-generated answers are higher than we would sometimes hold people to account for, which I think what it points to, and I love your point. I think with the AI example, actually it's going to be the way it frees up people's time to have the breakthrough moments because of the insights they get from being able to pool this massive source of information.
And also I think it's I wouldn't rely on it to do the last mile or to make the final decision.
Yeah.
Okay, necessarily. But in getting people to a better starting point from which they can get to a better destination as humans. I buy the benefits there. And I think I also buy the benefits in terms of a kind of checklist, which is, have you thought about this? And I've found it actually in my use of it. Occasionally it has moments of brilliance, by the way. I don't think it's fair to say that it's just, a kind of average of kind of, mediocre human best practice. Yeah. It has occasional inspired moments. It's never come up with a good joke for some weird reason yet, which is an odd kind of dog that didn't bark in the night. But it does have moments of inspiration. And one thing I noticed is that when I set it challenges like how do you improve a train journey, it looked at a mixture of engineering and psychological factors. Now, to be honest, an awful lot of human engineers wouldn't even consider, if we had really nice seats in the train, would people mind if it was 10 minutes slower?
Yeah.
A lot of engineers wouldn't even factor that in. And so in terms of covering the waterfront and breaking out of siloed thinking, I think it can be quite useful, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so that's great. So bring it back to finance and extending the bee analogy, right? I think you have, frankly, your worker bees that need to do the routine stuff, and the sort of the normal business of finance is really important. It's a non-negotiable. But getting this balance right with who are the people actually looking at some of those opportunities to do things differently, the scout bees that can achieve different things, I think is an important balance for finance leaders. So we talk about in this context of protecting value, which is sort of seen as the sort of the historic role of finance, but now there's opportunity to create value. So as you think about opportunities for finance leaders to be shifting the perception of where they've come from to where they need to be going forward, how would you think about?
Again, I'm channeling Roger L. Martin a little bit here, because his point was that he thinks, now this seems quite harsh to me, that actually the median CFO is actually deleterious to strategy. And he thinks it's the best quartile who are actually valuable. And one of them is looking at decisions probabilistically. And an interesting example there, understanding that the world is probabilistic, not deterministic. Yeah. There's a wonderful story which I think comes from Richard Thaler, the now Nobel Prize winning author of Nudge. And he went to the board of directors of a very large American company. And he tried this experiment where he went around the table to the heads of their kind of 8 largest divisions and said, okay, I can offer you all a decision where the chance of success is 50%, and in which case you'll increase your revenue and your profits by 50%. 20% of the time, nothing will happen. 30% of the time, you'll lose 30% of your revenue and 30% of your profit. So it's a thought experiment. So it's never that linear, right? Okay. Which of you would take that decision? And of the 8 people, 6 said no and 2 said yes. And he then asks, well, why wouldn't you take that decision given that on balance, you're going to end up better off? They said, because a third of the time I'd lose my job. Okay. And it's worth noting that the incentives for people are very asymmetric. Yeah. In other words, career suicide and shame and loss of job is the downside risk. The upside gain is often a pat on the back. Okay. Yeah. Not true in things like city trading, but in most areas of business, there's this massive risk aversion created by asymmetry of risk and reward. But what was interesting is that 6 of the 8 said, no, I wouldn't touch that because, I could probably do it once and get away with it, a bit like Russian roulette. But if I do that every year, I won't survive for more than 2.5 years on average. Yeah. And interestingly, the chief executive at the end of the table looks completely bemused and goes, but I want all of you to take those odds because net, we're definitely going to end up. Unless we're spectacularly unlucky, effectively of the 8 of you, what is it? 50% of you will be 50% more profitable, and let's say 2 of you will be a little less profitable. Well, actually, that's a win, in nearly all foreseeable outcomes. And then you realize, of course, that when you effectively push risk aversion down the organization, okay, you create more and more risk aversion because at the top, people can accept probabilistically, look, swings and roundabouts. At the bottom, when every single person is exposed to that same asymmetry of risk and reward, you basically create an organization that's paranoid. Yeah. In other words, do not disappoint under any circumstances. Yeah. You also have some wonderfully asymmetric effects in things like procurement, where they realize that it's much better off getting everybody to drop their prices by 3% every year, because if you get someone to, a friend of mine worked in procurement for a large car company, and on his sort of first week at work, he went and negotiated someone down by 8%, and his boss was furious. No, I told you to negotiate them down by 3. He said, but I got them down to 8. He said, I know. What are we going to do next year? Yeah. Okay. So there are these huge asymmetries in incentives. Now, in finance, of course, predictability is disproportionately appealing. Yeah. And also, I suppose, at least one's opinion of your investors or the stock market is that they really, really value predictability. But of course, you can change that with a good narrative, which is we're taking this risk. You can actually explain why the risk makes sense. Yeah. So that's the big thing. Demanding too much proof, regarding a ridiculous burden of proof, can be a problem. Now, on the upside, and again, this is a bit of Roger L. Martin, there are insights that finance people have about the business that marketing simply haven't got a clue about. In other words, not many marketing people would understand the full. Let's say you're a hotel. Okay. A lot of marketing people, now I think they should go and damn well find out, but a lot of marketing people wouldn't know what is the cost of turning over a hotel room, in other words, replacing the sheets, rather than leaving it empty for the night. And the insight from that will be, well, hold on, if it only costs $15 to turn over a hotel room, theoretically, I'm not saying you should, we could take in guests at midnight who'd pay us $50 to stay in a hotel, okay, and we'd still turn a profit. It's, they're undoubtedly, I think, going into the weeds of where the business makes money, where the business loses money, and in many cases, the sort of strange butterfly effects where changing one or two seemingly unimportant metrics can make a huge difference to your profitability. Those insights should really drive strategy, and often they don't, I think.
Yeah. And again, picking up on your point around risk, it is risk management, not risk elimination. Yes. And I think a lot of people in finance potentially struggle with that, and particularly to a point where it becomes systematic, it can drive unintended consequences. And I love your points around the asymmetry, and I think it comes back to some of the sort of behavioral economics insights, which is loss aversion is a much stronger driver of human behavior
than gain.
Than gain.
Yeah.
So again, bringing it back to the finance context, and a lot of the measurement of success ultimately is through shareholder value. And I'm interested in again your perspectives on
this. Is, I think, a terrible perspective, because it isn't your shareholders who give you money. Your shareholders are actually a fairly poor way of raising capital, I would argue, compared to the alternatives. Ultimately, it's your customers who give you money. Okay, but what's important about that, I think, is that a focus on customer value creation, one, unites far more people in the organization. A lot of people, some people in your organization may be, time servers or swinging the lead, but a large proportion of them enjoy doing what it is that the organization does for customers and would like to do it better and would like to do it more efficiently and would like to do more of it. Okay. Yep. The number of people who get out of bed who are motivated by enriching, say, I don't know, the state of Wisconsin DMV pension fund is relatively small. And effectively, you have to bribe the very senior people to care about shareholder value with enormous incentive schemes, which then completely disconnects them from the motivations of the organization as a whole. But there's another really interesting thing, which is that, and this is a point that John Kay makes, which never occurred to me. I worked in marketing for bloody ages. And he said, if you look at the companies that have been in the FTSE for ages, or you look at the companies that have been in the Fortune 500, okay, yep. P&G, Unilever, Nestle, okay, they're disproportionately consumer goods companies. I mean, P&G is 1837, I think it was founded, okay? And it's been in that index for, 180 years or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, his argument, John Kay's argument, is that their focus on the consumer through the lens of marketing keeps them agile and relevant in a way that businesses that develop these kind of artificial economic proxies, the idea being that effectively business competition is all about operational efficiency and cost cutting.
Yep.
Okay. Those businesses which are less consumer focused or less customer focused, they may make quite a lot of money for a short time as they stumble on something fortunate,
yep.
but they're surprisingly and increasingly short-lived. Now, P&G, Unilever, Nestle keep on going.
Yep.
And so part of the value of marketing, which of course is never really measured, is longevity,
yep.
just continued relevance. And that fascinates me because one of the interesting problems you notice with businesses, don't get me wrong, there is such a thing as cost leadership, but it does require you to be significantly cheaper than your competition. But an awful lot of activity to reduce cost doesn't get you to cost leadership. It just gets you to cost parity with all your competitors. That's not a winning position. So you've put in a huge amount of effort really to get nowhere. You would have been better off actually justifying a price premium and going after a different segment of the market.
Yeah.
Or trying to find, and this is the great thing is, the laws of physics and economics are absolutely rigid, okay? The laws of psychology, you can rewrite them yourself. Now, that drives deterministic people practically insane because they want to live in a world which is entirely rule-bound and predictable. So I can understand why people who, engineers often find marketing infuriating because to them it's cheating, you see. You should be aiming to produce the fastest train, not the train that's most enjoyable to ride on.
Yeah.
But I would argue, look, what we should have done with high speed too is we should have given, one of the briefs should have gone to an engineering firm, but another brief should have gone to Disney. And Disney would have rewritten the question. Disney would have said, not what's the fastest way of getting people in capacity at a low cost between London and Manchester. Disney would have said, how can we make the train journey between Manchester and London so bloody enjoyable people feel stupid going by car?
Yeah.
And it's actually a lot cheaper to make a train journey fun than it is to make it fast. And it's a lot more environmentally friendly as well, I might add.
Yeah.
Okay. But nobody was asking that question because it was given to determinists, not to probabilistic thinkers or creative thinkers. Yeah. And what is interesting there, I think, genuinely, is that fundamentally an awful lot of really, really successful businesses exist because they stumbled on a psychological insight, either through insight and genius and general inspiration on their part, sometimes I think accidentally. One of the funniest stories, you'll love this from your consumer goods background, is everybody, absolutely literally everybody, told James Dyson, nobody wants to see the dirt, okay? I would pretty confidently argue that there's a parallel universe where James Dyson listened to that advice, made the vacuum cleaners opaque, and then ended up selling 250 vacuum cleaners, to be absolutely honest. There are all kinds of reasons. People like the workings, the elegance of the engineering is worth displaying, but also there's that immediate feedback loop of seeing the dirt come out of your carpet and into your vacuum cleaner, okay? And so that's a kind of psychological hack, which I don't think, there's a parallel universe, okay, in which everything's the same, except Steve Jobs was 30% less charismatic in that parallel universe. And in that universe, we're still using BlackBerries. Let's be honest about it, okay? Now, it is almost painful, either for people with an engineering or finance background, to acknowledge the extraordinary effect that seemingly trivial psychological factors can have on success and failure. And, a bit of me sympathizes. Maybe part of me wishes the world weren't quite so subject to these psychological butterfly effects. But we've just, if we want to work in a kind of free market economy, we've just got to acknowledge that and learn to live with it, I think.
Yeah, well, again, so many great insights there, so much to pick up on. I want to bring it back to, finance again. And so we talked a lot about actually thinking differently about how to create value, and again, hopefully that resonates with the audience, that we can get beyond just thinking about the costs and into value creation.
If you don't do marketing, you never ask this question, which Stafford Beer, the cybernetician, would say. He called this business philosophy, which is you have to spend some time as a business asking, what is value? Why do people value what we do? What are we in business for? What is our motivation for doing what we do? And what is their motivation for appreciating it? What makes us different? Because if you dodge those questions, you haven't got a strategy. You've just got a plan. Okay.
And I think that goes where I was going to go to, because I think one of the challenges for finance executives is the brand of the function and the perception. Right, where we go back to where we started. Finance is obviously often seen as being the people that say no, they prevent some of the progress. So I think there is a branding issue.
And sometimes, by the way, that's very wise. Just to be absolutely clear, I need to rebalance what I've said, because sometimes they're absolutely right. Now, what you may say is that you shouldn't allow finance to tell you what to do. You should tell finance what you're doing. But if they panic and they raise perfectly healthy objections, you should listen emphatically, because they know things that you don't. And I mentioned that about the internal financial dynamics of some businesses. There are businesses where actually a small behavioral change on the part of consumers could make an enormous difference to the profits of a business. And yet the marketing people or the strategist may not be aware of that. A very interesting marketing idea where you need to know the financials would be the Ocado green van. I don't know if you know that. It encourages people to pick delivery slots when Ocado are already delivering nearby. Now, the maths of working out the gains to that and what proportion of people need to do it for it to fully pay, patently that's a finance person is the only person who can answer that question. And a finance person could be having that idea.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. They're best placed to do so.
Yeah. So that's the point I'm really trying to get at. So how as a finance person do you change the perception? Because to your point, the finance people have all this insight, but I think oftentimes they would feel excluded from some of those commercial conversations, because actually the insights they can provide aren't necessarily understood or appreciated.
So all that's needed, I think, is effectively what you might call a different mode of thinking, which is the mode of thinking we tend to deploy when we don't have all the information we need, or when what we don't know is more important than what we do. And it's kind of abductive inference, I think, is the technical term. And it's kind of what would happen if, or what would have to be true if, is a Roger Martinism, okay, where to play, how to win. And if the finance person is merely looking at behavior without imagining how finances would be different if only the behavior were different, and, what are the behaviors you could adopt? There are wonderful cases where, by the way, you can have a brilliant financial idea and it's a psychological catastrophe. And the example was, a hotel that had the seemingly brilliant idea, quite a premium hotel. And it simply said, when people arrived early, they said, if you want to check in early to your room, okay, that'll be, £50. They thought they'd done the calculations. It was going to earn them a fortune. Okay. The problem was that by saying you can check in early to your room, but it costs you 50 quid, you were kind of admitting that the room was already available. So that's a wonderful case where it's perfectly rational economically, but psychologically it's a disaster.
Yeah.
But equally, late checkout, you can probably get money from quite a lot of people offering that, actually. Yeah. If you could actually identify the customers where you wouldn't be incommoded by a late checkout, and you said, by the way, let us know if you'd like a late checkout. And then you kind of said, depending on how late they wanted to be, you can have that for free. Or if they wanted to check out absurdly late, I'm afraid if you stay until 8, it will have to be this much. I think you could actually bring in quite a lot of money that way.
Yeah.
And that's all about knowing that, the complexities of kind of the cost of, room service, the cost of cleaning, when people tend to arrive, when people tend to leave. That's a pretty data intensive job, but you could undoubtedly create some value there.
Well, and I love, you keep coming back to this theme of, understanding the data, but then getting the customer and the psychological insight together. And that's where the real power comes from. So
absolutely, yeah. If you can combine the two, you've got a real powerhouse. And by the way, I mean, my hope for behavioral science and behavioral economics is it can be a common language between marketing and finance. Yep. First of all, because you're talking about behavior. You're not talking about some proxy measure like, unprompted awareness, or brand health. Okay, you're talking about behavior to which you can attach a value. So you are at least in the finance person's wheelhouse at that point. And also you're talking about, psychology and a recognized body of economic literature rather than a load of marketing weird stuff about brand.
I think your point about a common language is really important, right? Because again, too often finance relies on...
I will hang out with finance people in Ogilvy and talk about behavioral economics because they find it really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And their whole questions in B2B, of course, we're a B2B business as you are, an EY. Yeah. And there is still an awful lot of psychology, a huge amount of psychology in B2B, for instance.
At the end of the day, it's people buying.
It's people buying people to a very large extent, yeah.
Yeah. So just to round us out, Rory, because we could carry on talking for hours, but to make it very tangible for the finance leaders, because one of the big things they're responsible, obviously, is the transformation of their functions. And what we talk about a lot in this podcast is, how finance leaders prepare for this uncertain.
To what extent can they be replaced with AI? Do you think? Are they nervous?
That's part of the challenge. I think there will clearly be change, but how do you prepare for that?
What terrifies me about every organisation is they're looking at AI first and foremost to replace the people who do what they actually do, right? So, is AI medicine replacing doctors? Or it's AI drones replacing soldiers. But actually, at some level, what worries me is the administration, what you might call the bureaucracy in organizations, will make the decisions about the deployment of AI mysteriously to their own advantage. So they will see themselves as now programming, or prompt writing for AI. The extent to which organizations are led by the shareholder value movement to see the people in the organization who do the thing that the organization exists for as a cost strikes me as truly horrendous. I mean, marketing, Peter Drucker, he claims that the only two things a business does are value and marketing and innovation. Everything else is a cost. Now, that's a hell of an extreme position, which I'm not even sure I'd adhere to entirely myself, okay? But nonetheless, the extent to which we've got into a mindset where, in many cases, there is an organization at the top that, in some senses, comes to resent the people who do the things that the customer actually pays for. And you see this, by the way, in terrible things like underinvestment in customer service. And that's nothing to do with the fact that customer service isn't valuable. It's rather like the business that finance people have introduced all these self-checkouts at supermarkets because they're looking for operational efficiency. Two problems. One, people have started nicking things. Okay, there are some branches where they sell more carrots than they buy, and the reason is that people are checking out avocados and pretending they're carrots. But the second thing nobody seemed to notice is you can't really do a big weekly shop through a self-checkout till. It's great if you've got a basket. It's great as an option,
Yeah.
But when it becomes an
Can't be the only-
obligation because you're driving your customers to the lowest cost channel, you're effectively losing those really big shops. Now, if you're a big Tesco Extra or whatever, it's the big shop which is the rationale to go to Tesco Extra in the first place because you want the range. So the whole thing, there's this absolute obsession with operational efficiency as if consumers want it necessarily. The cost is what you might call immediate and salient and quantifiable. And the benefit is unquantifiable, in some ways, nebulous and deferred. And so you have this fundamental problem that an opportunity cost is always harder to quantify than a cost. And so anybody who's focused on purely the sort of reductionist business of cost reduction will create this appalling situation where you cut costs visibly while invisibly destroying opportunities, including future customer value and so forth. And so there is this fundamental problem that if you are obsessed with what you can measure, you end up with this quantification bias. The FT wrote this piece saying, how did customer service get so bad? And I felt like saying, well, if the FT itself occasionally acknowledged there was something interesting about a business other than its quarterly financial returns, you wouldn't have been in this pickle to begin with. But that fundamental problem, which is that costs are always immediate and quantifiable and opportunities are always probabilistic. My argument would be that if you have an overly powerful finance function, consequently, I think what's interesting there is that there is a danger in certain categories, like, for example, what you might call distance commerce, where if the customer service, or insurance for that matter, if you end up with 20 to 30% of people having had 2 or 3 really bad customer experiences of the thing, they will abandon not just the brand, but the whole category. In other words, they'll go, okay, so you have something which is a bit of an economic gift to business, which is consumers' readiness to actually engage and exchange money with you, remotely through digital channels. And the risk you face is that it isn't just your brand that suffers. Actually, if a category drops below a certain level of trust, the category dies. Now, if you think that's totally implausible, the example I always give of that is timeshare. Timeshare was a really good idea, right? Yeah. Nobody wants to own a house in Fuerteventura for 52 weeks of the year, unless you want to, actually emigrate there. But there are a hell of a lot of people who'd like to own a tenth of a house in Fuerteventura. Brilliant idea. Unfortunately, it was so profitable, it attracted 20% of the people operating there were basically crooks. Okay. Once you fall below that level of expectation of trust, I mean, broadly speaking, it's just about dragging its way back through the rebranding as fractional ownership. Okay, yeah. Right? Or, but you can genuinely, I think if level, it's the old London taxi driver. The reason London taxi drivers police each other and they have the knowledge is they know that you only need the black cab. You only need 3% of black cabbies to be crooks, and people's willingness to actually hail one on the street disappears. So we need to really, really worry about this because it's not just a brand risk, which it is. It's also, in some cases, I think, a category risk.
Fantastic. Well, Rory, it's been wonderful to have this conversation.
What a pleasure.
And you've done a beautiful job wrapping it up with, I think there's balance between short-term and long-term thinking.
And easy to prove and hard to prove.
And easy to prove, I think is hopefully so relevant for many finance leaders. And just to, again, round it out, I think the opportunity, as we look at opportunities from AI and other automation, it's really, again, how that frees up time to spend with this integration to the customer-facing insights.
By the way, a finance person who went to the marketing department and said, if you could generate this one behavior, it would make more difference to my life than anything else. And maybe that's what should happen, that every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, the finance person should go. For example, an awful lot of the cost of customer service actually arises from not getting it right the first time. It's people effectively ringing back repeatedly. So if you can get everybody who rings customer service effectively, that's a wonderful marketing achievement. It's also probably a huge financial gain as well.
Yep.
There are these win-wins, I think, dotted all over the place.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great insight to end on. So Rory, really appreciate you being here.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you to our listeners as always. If you've enjoyed this or any episode of the EY Better Finance podcast, please leave a rating or review and don't forget to subscribe so you get future episodes. You'll find related links in the show notes or at ey.com/betterfinance. As always, thank you for listening. And if you have ideas or topics you'd like to see covered or guests you'd like to see featured, please don't hesitate to reach out. I look forward to speaking to you next time on the EY Better Finance podcast.